As a young graduate student in the early 1990s, I recall sitting in a first-year planning theory course taught by John Friedman and being introduced to a book with an elegant blue and white cover and a deceptively simple title, Planning in the Face of Power. I hadn't read any Habermas, and my knowledge of Foucault was quite thin, but there was something in that book that resonated with my experience at the time working in the Latino community of Los Angeles on immigrants' rights issues. Planning, John Forrester seemed to argue, was only partly about solving technical problems. It oftentimes, though not always, involved politics, defined not in terms of high geopolitical statecraft, but in the sense, as Barry Needham might have put it, rolling up your sleeves and getting your hands dirty. The dirt in question would reveal the micro-interactions and the practices of what Forrester called participatory planning, the incremental and deliberative negotiation of discrepant viewpoints and speech communities, the gradual and frequently tension-filled achievements of the shared bonds of community interest. Crucially, the book understood conflict to be not an external and therefore unwanted barrier to the efficient functioning of rational systems, but comprised the very stuff of the planning discipline. Importantly, beyond the novel theoretical framings on offer, John Forrester's book and subsequent writings, together with Friedman's Planning in the Public Domain, provided my generation with a sense of its own professional identity and mission. A mission, I would argue, we carry on here in Nijmegen, whether we plan for the upgrading of Schiphol Airport, devise improved water management techniques for our much admired dikes, streamline our public transportation systems, or reflect on the more democratically accountable institutions governing the spaces of our internal European borderlands, or in Brussels speak, the Euro-regions. John has been very prolific since that time. He wants me to take note of a book that came out in 1999 called The Deliberative Practitioner, and I would also use this as a plug for a forthcoming book in press with Oxford University Press entitled Dealing with Differences, Dramas of Mediating Public Disputes. So some 20 years on from that first encounter in print, it is a privilege to introduce our Alexander von Humboldt guest lecturer this evening, on sabbatical from Cornell University this year as a Nicis Professor of Planning at the University of Amsterdam, Professor John Forrester. Welcome.
Thanks very much. Thank you for a more than gracious introduction. That was lovely. I asked for the mention of the deliberative practitioner in part because what I'm talking about today really grows right out of that book and the line of analysis in that book. The title tonight combines both method and object in a way, and so I'd like to talk about what I'm calling a critical naturalistic discourse analysis as a style and approach of work, and the particular problem that I'm worried about and that I would really like some help with when we have some time for questions and answers, as I know we'll have. The problem is to think about, to see how it is that in discourse analysis we might explore both what Aletta Norval talks about as democratic subject formation and what in a sort of Laclau-Muffian agonistic democratic line of theorizing is much less discussed and seems to me even more critical, as critical, maybe more than democratic subject formation, is the enactment of democratic intersubjectivity. So that we're not only thinking about democratic subjects, but we're talking about the Constitution and enactment and performance in intersubjective relationships. Right? So I'd like to present the work, and then have lots of questions, and you can help me get it right. Okay? So I want to tell you a story in 3 parts that's about doing discourse analysis and provides a particular example as well. There's one part about teaching and interviewing, editing and voice. There's a second one, more obviously, about democratic politics, agonism, and practical judgment. And there's a third that's still more explicitly about how organizers and natural actors might actually teach us, if we listen closely to them, to do better discourse analysis in our everyday political life as well as in our research and writing. So to begin, I was in a classroom teaching an undergraduate course on the politics of planning, and what happened changed about 10 years of my life. I'd been interested then as now in the micropolitics of planning, what in practice in cities and neighborhoods and city halls and community meetings and community organizing contexts, planners and organizers do practically, not just as matters of good critical intentions, right? Not just as matters of general aspirations toward equality and autonomy and solidarity and so on, but as matters of day-to-day practical and more or less effective work. Faced with power imbalances and stages of everyday action deeply infused and permeated and structured by relations of power and reputation, power and identity, how might oppositional planners, for example, ever get anything done? If, that is, we're not to presume ahead of time that nothing ever changes. If we're to assume instead a world of indeterminate contingency, if we're to think politically about what can change instead of metaphysically about what has to be taken as unchangeable and fixed. Okay? So I wanted to explore work in the face of power, how in practice power was enacted, staged, attributed, reproduced, employed, and resisted, not how power was automatically determinate, but how it was contingently and historically expressed. So, planning in the face of power. So my students had read John Gaventa's wonderful, historically rich and detailed Power and Powerlessness, a careful analysis that honors its title and shows in painful and revealing detail many faces of power and struggle, of threat and manipulation, of inequality and aspirations for basic human dignity. We had read and discussed, too, a best-selling negotiation primer whose premise, of course, involved difference and disagreement, otherwise there's no reason to negotiate, right? Incommensurability, no reason to think that diverse concerns could be monetarized, for example, and historical relational interdependence, the need to work things out, if not quite come to terms together. So we'd studied power, we'd studied negotiation quite concretely. I'd asked my students one Thursday afternoon to read something extra for the following Tuesday's class. This reading would be purely optional, I said, but if they were able to make time, they might find it interesting. I thought even if we were breaking from traditional academic discourse, because here, in her own words, would be the story of the day-to-day work of a recent graduate of our department, we can call her Maxine, who was working for the city of New York to connect LaGuardia Airport to Kennedy Airport by subway. Right? They would read Maxine's story. My research assistant, Linda Choo, had interviewed Maxine, and Linda had come to me 2 weeks earlier with a 3-page description of Maxine's work. Could I share it with my students, I wondered, to give them a sense of the situated day-to-day transportation planning practice in New York? I couldn't do it. Even though Linda's draft was perfectly competent, she'd worked as a journalist before returning for her master's study, I found it too descriptive, too much the newspaper account, and too little the inside story of Maxine's work. So I turned to the wonderful collection Working by Studs Terkel, and I asked Linda, could you go back to your interview tape and try this way of working with what you heard, with what you have on tape, so you could transcribe it? Could you try to do a practice-focused version of what Terkel did in Working, Edit the interview to convey the interview story in her actual words as told to you, and incorporate your questions into the text, perhaps with brackets or annotation, so that the reader learns about her work somewhat more directly, less mediated by your representation of her work, of what you heard. So Linda came back 10 days later with a longer draft, this time a well-edited, flowing presentation in Maxine's own words of her work for the city on the airport connection problem. 3 pages had become 9, as related to Linda in the interview, but here we had not only a quotation here and there, but more of a narrative, not just a sequence of questions and answers, but more of an articulated drama of the planner's story, midwifed, to be sure, by Linda's combined interviewing, editing, and representing of Maxine's own words. So I passed that out to my students, and, skeptical and underwhelmed as they usually were, they took copies and went off for the rest of their courses on the weekend. On the following Tuesday, when I asked, with no particular expectations, who had been able to read this extra paper that Linda had produced, I was hardly surprised when only half of the class raised their hands. But what I heard in the next half hour, however, I hadn't heard in 15 years in the classroom. Marjorie Shapiro's hand was raised, and I remember it like yesterday. She was a competitive swimmer, I'd heard, and what had she made of this story, I wondered. Now I know what to tell my mother, Marjorie said, when she asks me, concerned about my future career, just what do planners do? Now, in an interdisciplinary field like planning, like city and regional planning, that question haunted and still haunts faculty and students alike, because in part, as my Berkeley colleague and friend Stephen Bloom is fond of reminding us, nature is not organized the way universities are. Right? Nature is not organized the way universities are. Real work fits poorly into the university categories. But here somehow, from this story, Marjorie now thought she had a way to break this knot, to communicate not to some faculty member, not to some specialist professional, but to her own mother about what planners actually did. How strange was this reaction, I thought, to what was essentially an edited interview. Right? But the strange soon turned to the positively uncanny. Sean was sitting next to Marjorie. He'd raised his hand too, so I asked him what he made of Linda's interview profile of Maxine's work. What he replied still echoes, still resonates with me, and it finds itself further supported too by students' critical responses to many other profiles we've done since then, even now 20 years later. Sean said simply, "This paper is the most practical thing I have read in this program in 3 years." One simple sentence. I can still hear the words. This paper is the most practical thing I have read in this program in 3 years. Now, I was astounded, and more problematically, I was dumbfounded as well. I didn't know, I always say, whether to laugh or to cry. I was delighted, of course, being all too much the theorist usually exploring critical and social political theories, that I'd found a way to convey a real sense and appreciation of the messiness and improvised and creative qualities of planning's practice. But I was also puzzled, intrigued, confused, and even dismayed that Sean had found this piece so much more practical than the detailed and grounded Gaventa study, more practical even than the vividly illustrated and plainly written negotiation primer that we had read, and to make matters much worse, or better as it turned out, more practical too than everything else he had read in our Cornell program for the last 3 years. This was no dumb kid. This was a bright group of kids. So how was it possible? Right? What was going on? How, I wanted to know, had Linda's interview, edited in this way to retain her voice, edited as it was in this way to retain her interviewee's voice, Maxine's voice, how had it accomplished something that so much other work in sociology and political science and economics and urban studies that they had been reading had not? I spent the next several years exploring this question, step by step, essay by essay, in teaching and writing that led to my 1999 book, The Deliberative Practitioner, a book through which a book through which I could deepen from what I'd done before, my accounts of speech and action, of performativity and performance and discourse, by moving past a speech act analysis, claim by claim, claim by counterclaim, which is what the earlier book did, now to the analysis of narrative, story, and discourse, seen less argumentatively, more discursively, less semiotically, more pragmatically. Marjorie and Sean, Linda and Maxine were all teaching me, of course, about a way of doing discourse analysis, making it possible for me to see how a simple story, edited differently, could produce such astounding results, such astounding difference seen in the context at hand. 3 years of our best curricular efforts, for example, as one of those contexts. But in the moment that I've recalled, of course, I hardly knew what it was that had happened. I knew something important was up, but not what it was. So what was it? Surely whatever it was not just another case study. And it wasn't just the listing of the negotiated complexities of New York City. Surely it wasn't any key event in what was a quite ordinary, if complex, story of professional practice in a big city. There was nothing particularly distinctive, striking, or out of the ordinary in Maxine's, the transportation planner's, story. So what was going on? 6 weeks later, I came across a footnote with an alluring citation to Martha Nussbaum's finally aware and richly responsible Literature and the Moral Imagination, reprinted among other places in her 1990 collection, Love's Knowledge, in what I suggest will stand as one of the finest pieces of discourse analysis ever written, even though not using that terminology. Nussbaum takes on the question how we might learn about ethics from novels, right? How we might learn about ethics from novels. Novels, after all, are cooked, right? They describe events that never happened. They're fantastic rather than scientific. They're imagined rather than reporting empirical history, for example. So what sense can it make to argue that we can learn about real ethics, obligation, loyalty, kindness, betrayal, self-sacrifice, generosity, courage, care, concern, from fantastic words on a novelist's page? It's made up. Never happened. Right? Nussbaum's analysis explains far more than she set out to explain. For in her analysis, I found a richly nuanced, morally sensitive, practically attuned, and normatively detailed account of how Marjorie and Sean had been learning from Maxine's story, what they discerned about the multiple and ambiguous moral entanglements of her work, what they learned from the selective framing and agenda setting of her word choice, what they could now see through the expressive emotion and passion, the dramatic hopefulness and irony in her voice, how they could perceive through Maxine's account both uniquely situated particulars and general institutional obligations as Maxine faced them phenomenologically, as Maxine struggled interpretively at work to make sense of them, and hardly least of all, as Maxine struggled pragmatically to work through and even change them. Change those particulars, right? So in the next several years that followed, I began to collect more of these profiles of practitioners, so-called, and with the help of student assistant extraordinaire Brian Kreisworth, we edited several volumes of collected profiles of practitioners working in fields as disparate as environmental planning, historic preservation, community development, participatory action research, and more. I began to use the profiles to complement more traditionally theoretical readings in classes. The theoretical work helped us to see more in the profiles. The profiles helped us to see more in the theoretical arguments. Slowly, too, I encouraged students to do term projects that would be built around their analysis of a profile that they would produce, following an interview with a practitioner of their choice, someone interested in making a difference in the world in the ways they find fascinating, challenging, potentially instructive. Right? I'd advise the students, ask your interviewee not what they think about changing the world, but how they've acted in real cases to do it. Not how they think about it, how they've tried to do it. Get their stories, transcribe, analyze, and appreciate and never forget the circularity here. Notice what you didn't ask. Notice how you helped shape the story, how your transcribing choices shape the resulting account, how your editing modulates what your interviewee does in telling the story, how your analysis depends on all this and more, even the tone that you've heard but can barely transcribe. So now my students were exploring practical and discursive struggles to change the world in ways that fascinated them. The students chose the interviewee in the field of the student's choice and tried to look through their accounts. So students now talk to environmental activists, excuse me. The students now talk to environmental activists, landscape designers, feminist peacemakers, community organizers, refugee camp workers, business and legal negotiators, community justice advocates, among many others, talking and organizing for change. In every case, the students, undergraduate and graduate alike, have to grapple with a variant of interviewing and discourse analysis that's practically pitched, and as I do in my research, we do this in a quite particular way. All along the way, from choosing an interviewee, through doing the interview, through transcribing, through writing it up and analyzing it. The central guidelines that shape these resulting profiles lead the interviewers to do four things. First, to inquire about a challenging, realistically messy and instructive case. Second, crucially, to ask, how did you come to do X rather than why did you do X? Third, and even more importantly, to ask persistently actor-focused rather than spectator-focused questions. Fourth, to ask wherever possible, how did you respond to the mayor's threat, for example, rather than what do you think about the mayor's threat? Extremely simple, but you get a completely different kind of material as a result. If you ask what do you think about X, or how did you respond to X? Now, we can call this the very beginning of a critical naturalistic discourse analysis. Critically, we explore not just situated cases, but those presenting challenges and opportunities. As the interviewees we choose draw upon their local knowledge to select what they find daunting, difficult, complex, politically challenging, and what they find to illustrate possibilities for change, spaces where they can make a difference in the world as they intimately know it, domains where they find opportunities that others don't see. Naturalistically, we try less to see by standing on the shoulders of giants in the received literature than to see by developing, even enveloping, our practical judgment, informing our practical judgment, by listening closely to the perceptions and insights and recognizing the framings and inscriptions of our interviewees. Right? Naturalistically, too, we try to evoke not the rationalizing justifications, not the reductive reasoning why, but the deceptively simple, more ordinary practice stories of these engaged interviewees. Stories not pre-scripted and framed by this popular theory or that one, French or German, British or American. And I was now a long way from Nussbaum's Aristotle, a longer way from Habermas, maybe closer to the pragmatist than to Foucault. So the second part. So Sean and Marjorie, Linda and Maxine had changed not only my way of teaching, but they changed my research approach to the micropolitics of planning and governance as well. After building on Nussbaum's work on discernment and practical judgment to explore actual efforts to enact democratic deliberations via citizen participation efforts here, or community organizing or participatory action research there, all in the deliberative practitioner, I turned increasingly to pay attention to the discourses of a sort of canary in the mine. If agonism and democratic politics meant dealing inescapably with diverse and deep differences, I wanted to speak to those actually engaging those differences all the time, whose real lives and struggles confronted power, difference, relationship building, and exploration of new possibility all the time, situated interaction by interaction, even word by word, whose struggles day to day were engaging head-on the issues that so many theorists of democracy and discourse, deliberation and difference, were otherwise trying to write about, if often so inscrutably writing about them. Right? I want to know who faces these problems of difference, of deep difference, of value difference, of incommensurability all the time. Who's living with it, working on it? What's it look like? So I turned to a series of interviews with mediators of public disputes, thus this book that's coming out, and with mediators and with community intermediaries, who instructively enough quickly disavowed the clumsy label of mediator altogether. They don't like getting stuck in a category. Here were practitioners trying to bring together, for example, fundamentalist religious parties with gay activists and sex workers and community of color activists all in the same room to see if they could address issues of HIV/AIDS education and prevention, for example. Here were practitioners bringing together members and leaders of indigenous groups in Australia or Canada or the US, bring them together with government officials, real estate developers, white settlers, environmentalists, and others to address police and security issues, environmental issues, land use planning questions. Here were practitioners working to assist or facilitate, in the common language, to facilitate, if possible, in the face of police-community relations controversies, other public policy or regulatory disputes that had been unhappily bouncing from courtroom to courtroom and political attack to political counterattack for years in a not-so-civil society. I wanted to know how these intermediaries worked in between groups who trusted each other not at all, groups who cared for each other even less. What did these practitioners have to say? How did they listen? Of course, they could not and did not believe everything they heard in the midst of such conflict. So how did they do their own naturally situated discourse analysis? As they heard the table pounding from this one, the righteous religious indignation of that one, the official jargon of this one, the palpable threat of that one. How'd they do it? Often these intermediaries, it seemed, worked cyclically through several challenges. Assessment, interviewing representatives of conflicting groups and assessing possibilities of their meeting with one another, convening meetings in which all representatives could speak to what they feel needs to be said and could listen to one another doing exactly the same thing, learning, creating a space in which these representatives could learn together, inquire together about the issues and events that promise to affect them all, and then come to decisions. And so, not least of all, negotiating, assessing, convening, learning, only at the way distant end, negotiating, crafting practical steps via proposals for action that could actually address real concerns and interests, real aspirations and fears. That's what these people were doing. Now, from the outside, I understand this work sounds fantastic, right? Deep religious difference, and so on. I understand that few people, too, imagined that Nelson Mandela would see the light of day outside of prison. Few believed that the deeply racist United States would elect an African-American community organizer turned politician, Barack Obama, as president. Someone was saying the other day, if you heard that there was a movie, kid grows up in Kenya, moves to the United States, gets an education, marries a white hippie, has a baby, leaves his wife, the white hippie moves to Indonesia, kid goes to school there, goes back to the United States, gets an education, goes to Harvard, becomes head of Harvard Review. Next thing you know, he's president of the United States. You'd never go to such a movie. You would say, this is Hollywood at its worst. Weird, very strange. So, nobody thought, this work that I'm describing of mediators sounds fantastic. Bringing these people together, getting something done. Well, they do it. It's really interesting how they do it. So, not only that, all too few representatives of environmentalists or real estate interests or hunters or state officials in these contentious mediated negotiations, they don't believe either that they're going to get agreements that really work for them, but they're willing to try sometimes because the courts have done even less for them, the political process has done even less for them, and little otherwise has been improving either. So, given the politics isn't getting much done, the courts aren't getting much done, sometimes they'll be willing to talk to a mediator and explore things, and that's the beginning. So when history hasn't been kind, when so many people in civil society imagine and construct impossibility so plausibly, and we imagine and construct democratic possibility, political possibility, with so much more difficulty, it seems. Contentious parties all know what they want, and they all have plenty to say with conviction about the other. Right? The intransigent, greedy, ideological, rapacious, self-righteous other. They all have their arguments, and the press feeds the flames. Right? So, constructing impossibility is easy. Constructing possibility is tough. So how do these intermediaries like mediators work to bring such contentious parties, each one another to one another, together at times? How do they help the parties learn and then help them develop working agreements that none of them present have thought possible in the beginning? Now remember, the intermediaries are only that. They don't produce solutions or agreements any more than midwives make babies. Right? And you are all clear, right? The midwife doesn't make the baby. The parents make the baby. The midwife delivers. Mediators do the same thing. The midwives are not the parties. Right? Hi, Barry. So I've been trying to find out in my research on mediators how they can bring together parties who, after all, know their problems better than any of the outsiders, and who nevertheless still find themselves surprised by the strategic results they can sometimes achieve through these processes. If we're interested in problems of democratic politics and power, we might find ourselves as observers just as instructively and surprised as some of the community and political activists have found themselves surprised in these processes. And we should ask how it works. But we might do even better now by asking how the intermediaries, as a matter of practice, have had to do actual discourse analysis in real time, as they worked between agonistic parties, between contentious parties, claiming every variant of difference imaginable along lines of doctrinal commitment, religious obligation, historical identity, need, interest, values, and more. We might learn, if we listen closely, not only about strategies of intermediation, but about discourse analysis, by assessing carefully how, in bitter situations of agonistic conflict, mediators and organizers have had to conduct real discourse analyses of their own, whether they call what they produce diagnoses or conflict assessment, interest analysis, or just fragments of stories of where they're at. Right? If we break the academic hegemony of those who are entitled to do real discourse analysis, we might see that our academic attention has been too narrow, too metaphilosophical, too self-referential, too disconnected from moral theory, too detached from ordinary speakers, and even too unintelligibly rendered than it needs to be. We can do better, but we have to change the game in so-called critical discourse analysis, which seems increasingly written in a language that we would be embarrassed to show or share with a great many critical activists whose intelligence and insights we respect. Right? So, part 3. So let's look at a few passages from an account of Jim Deers, a community organizer who worked recently for the government of Seattle, and before that for a whole set of neighborhoods, to support and empower diverse multi-ethnic neighborhoods on wide-ranging issues of security, employment, development pressures, environmental quality, and more. Deers had worked against government and within government. After his student activist days in college, he spent years working with the powerful and powerless alike to build Neighbor Power, the name of his book of stories about these efforts, Neighbor Power, so that as an organizer, he might become less and less visible, less and less necessary after all. In interviewing him, I was interested again not so much in what he thought abstractly, and less in what he theorized, but more in how he did the things he did, how he'd learned, how he recounted it, how he'd learned and changed his mind, how he'd been surprised, how he framed both issues as, or more importantly, how he framed both issues and, as, or more importantly, what he took to be opportunities and openings, possibilities for good critical work. So I asked Deers, as we sat in a borrowed office in Seattle, was it very different for you organizing, doing this work now in Rainier Valley, a low-income, multi-racial neighborhood of Seattle, having done all the student activism? Was it different? He said it was very different. The big differences are that I always had my own agenda and I could pick which issues I was going to work on. When I was doing peace organizing, I could work on Central America, I could work on whatever issues. But this, in Rainier Valley, was really having the community set their own issues. So this was very different. Then he added, The other one, I'd been very much out in front on the issues, leading rallies as a student. And learning the difference between a leader and an organizer was the important part here. I was trained by Tom Gadet, who drilled that into me, he says. Now I wondered, of course, about that important part, what the difference between a leader and an organizer really had come to mean to him. So here's how he put it. He said, the job of an organizer is really to help build strong communities and to empower communities. And if the organizers out there doing all the leadership functions, if they're deciding what issues should be worked on, if they're speaking at public meetings, if it's their strategy, if they're speaking to the press, then it's not empowering the community at all. It's just teaching them, reinforcing the message that they don't have any worth or any power. That was a hard lesson to learn, he says. That was a hard lesson to learn, because right out of college, I'm thinking, I'm probably more comfortable speaking to the press, and I can design the best flyer, and I can write the best press release. I know how to run a meeting. And sometimes you see new leaders coming up and they're stumbling, and your immediate interest is winning the issue, making them be successful. And you're trying to keep in mind the long-term interest. You also want to build leadership. That was tough, he says. It's still tough. It's one of the hardest lessons for everyone who cares about people. And he goes on. He said there's a basic iron rule of organizing, which is never do for the people what they can do for themselves. And I think it's critical. Most people who are in institutions, whether they're in human services, government, whatever, they're there because they care deeply about community. And yet they're often breaking down community because they're doing for people what they could do better for themselves. Now here we see Deers pulled between political objectives. He shows how it's still tough, he says, to be so internally conflicted. He has multiple goals and interests, not only in terms of long run and short, but in terms of success and failure, of winning on the issue at hand, hoping to build leadership as well. This internal subjective ambivalence reflects a micro-political debate about the character of leadership and the proper role of the organizer. The kind of good judgment that Deers problematizes here, can teach us not only about the contingent shaping of oppositional activism, oppositional activist sensibilities and subjectivities, but it can teach us also about what we could call a micropolitical inter-subjectivity, the micropolitical challenges of relating to others practically and performatively, because helping too much, he suggests, can preempt others' learning, preempt others' developing leadership abilities, their experience, their competence and confidence. Deers' critical analysis of such helping discourses reaches beyond anything that organizers say in their arguments or claim in terms of facts to what they do in that claiming pragmatically, as their practical discourse of preemptive and presumptuous leadership can create and shape relations of dependency and hierarchy, deference and distance, right? Ironically against everything he's trying to do. Now Deers goes on, though, to extend the point from one of the micropolitics of helping relationships, which is quite common, right, to one of institutional criticism, however ironic and poignant. Many people in human services or government do, he acknowledges, care deeply about community, but the mode of expression of the care can have perverse and unintentional consequences. Yes, they care deeply, yet they're breaking down community, he says, because they're doing for people what they could do better for themselves. Now this was just a beginning. I went on to ask Deers about lessons he'd learned later in his years of organizing, and his response, like his larger story, opened up many fruitful avenues, not just for like-minded organizers, but for critical listeners, critical discourse analysts, I suggest as well. Deers went on, I should just say a couple of other lessons I learned about starting from where people are. One is focusing on what people care about, what their passion is, learning that nobody's apathetic. Everybody cares about something, and it's just a matter of tapping into what it is. That was a really important lesson. He said, and then there's the whole thing about starting with a question rather than an answer. There's another one I learned subsequently, and I really learned this one from John McKnight, who works in Chicago with something called the Asset-Based Community Development Institute. He talks about his friend who was a duck hunter. And his friend taught him that every duck will respond to a call. It's just that there's a different call for every duck. Right? So there's one for the mallards, and there's one for the ganders, and there's one for other ducks, and the loons, and the coots, and everything. Too often as organizers, he says, too often as organizers, we're just sounding the loon call, and then we wonder why only the loons show up to our meetings. Right? And in fact, everybody will come. You just need to find their call. So there's many ways, he says, to get people. So there's many ways to get people engaged in community, and oftentimes the meeting call is the only call we put out there, and it's the one that people are least likely to respond to. People don't see results oftentimes from meetings. A lot of people are shy, they don't feel they can contribute much to meetings, but that's how much they care about community. Sometimes they show up even though they don't think they're having any real impact. So this is about sounding the social call and the volunteer call and the projects call. Projects are one of the most effective ways, he says, because their results in the short term, everybody can be involved, young and old, people with disabilities, all kinds of professions. In the process, you build relationships, and that's really what community is all about. And then people start getting involved in other aspects as well. Now notice that Deers suggests community mobilization doesn't happen by itself, that the forming of popular demands itself reflects a process of community organization, of creating a new community identity, an organization presenting and representing, standing for popular needs expressed, framed, perhaps demanded in a particular place, what theorists might call a new subject formation and articulation. Fine. But Deers challenges the commonplace pluralist belief in popular apathy that non-participation in pluralist processes reflects a lack of interest and concern among neighborhood residents and city dwellers. On the contrary, it suggests nobody's apathetic, everybody cares about something, which seems simple enough, but it's equally vague, isn't it? Right? But then he becomes more specific and more strategic. It's just a matter of tapping into what it is. This is a really important, that was a really important lesson. So for the organizer, knowing that everybody cares about something might be true and perhaps consoling, but it hardly produces concerted action or politically effective organization. Organizers need to know still more and do more, and at one point not long ago, Deers acknowledges that he too didn't know some of these things that he says he finds now still really important. So organizers can learn along with everybody else. Deers has come to understand oppositional organizing and relationship building differently than before, but what new has he come to see? He refers in passing to a point he's just discussed, but he finds it important enough to repeat it in the moment of identifying the really important lessons he's learned. As he put it, there's the whole thing about starting with a question rather than an answer. Here too, Deers characterizes the organizer's challenge of starting from where people are, which means, of course, not starting from the organizer's own substantive answer about what ought to be done or what the issues are or what the futures hold. Not starting from the organizer's answer, but differently. His point is not about a panacea or a surefire technique, not about some prime driver of popular economic interests or racial or gendered or class identity, but about a relationship that he as an organizer has learned to aspire to as he works with others, to start with questions rather than answers, to start by listening rather than by telling, to start by opening up rather than closing in, to start with a gesture toward others that asks for engaged and creative action, rather than with one that instructs others to do this or that. So Deers tells us that as an organizer, he's learned this, that he didn't always know this, and that we might also need to learn this as well. But what else does he suggest organizers need to learn? In this brief but striking passage, he suggests, I shall argue, that organizers must learn not only first about the character and constitution of the community, and not only secondly about themselves, their own political assumptions and biases, their own ways of framing issues, but also third about their own possible modes of discourse and address, ways of doing outreach, the kinds of relationships and connections, the inter-subjective understandings and senses of we that they can create. So organizers have to learn in part about their own blinding presumptions, the ways that their own concepts and discourse have held them captive, as Wittgensteinians would put it. He suggests, he's telling us wonderfully, too often as organizers, we're just sounding the loon call, and we wonder then why only the loons show up. Right? In this ironic, self-critical, and quite practically pitched passage, Deers unravels organizers' own discourse. We wonder why only the loons show up, he says, and too often we're just sounding the loon call. Not only haven't the organizers learned about the community, they haven't learned about the ways their own talk and outreach, their own discursive practice, shapes the audience and selectively shapes what's at issue, who might respond accordingly in the way in which they do. The particular style and focus of the loon call suggests too that the meetings that the organizers will hold will serve and address the concerns only of loons, saying nothing to and of others, indeed treating the others as all too invisible, if respecting them at all. And all of this done in the name of the broader community, but speaking the language practically, performatively of a select few, the loons. So not only may a relative few show up to our meetings, he says, but others might come actively to distrust and doubt the motives of these loony organizers, right? Right? This is not making friends. So Deers goes on, this is about sounding the social call, the volunteer call, the project's call in which everyone can get involved, young and old, people with disability and all kinds. Here he's appealing not just to a broader community, but to a more nuanced, differentiated discourse, one less issue-centered, less traditionally self-interest-centered, but nevertheless one responsive to distinct segments of the community. Some people will come for social reasons, to get to know their neighbors, to be part of the community. Some will come to volunteer and respond to the needs of others. Others might come to work on specific projects in more traditionally interest and issue-oriented ways. Notice that this criticism of organizers' talk, their practical discourse then, concerns both the formation of democratic subjectivities and democratic intersubjectivity too. Deers challenges the narrow construction of issue-oriented organizers' identities and roles no less than their presumptions of narrow community members' interests. But he goes significantly farther as he stresses the interactive, intersubjective ways that organizers can go wrong, even as they wonder why only the loons show up, or the ways that they can do better, presuming less, expanding and differentiating their ways of addressing community members' concerns. So Deers tells us not only about problems of organizers' knowledge, of their presumptions and structured biases, about problems of epistemology, but about ethics, relationships, and connectivity too. Not only pointing to a practical and desirable subjective stance of organizers, he speaks as well to the character of their interactions, the character of the practically evolving, reconstituting relationships between political subjects, the character of the intersubjectivity that might make it possible to organize. And he goes on to say, and in the process to build relationships, which he says is really what community is all about. One really important quality, his words, of that intersubjective relationships, he says, will be that it's co-generative, inquiring together, less a hierarchy of one with an answer and one who's being given that answer, more a conversation of questioning and jointly searching for ways that people who care about communities can start getting involved and not just on projects. Starting with a question starts with the organizer saying something about himself or herself, not so much, I know the answer and I'm here to tell it to you, as much as I don't have an answer that I'm committed to, but I have questions that you might care about too, that might open up discussion of concerns and new possibilities. Deers is suggesting that through such talk and political discourse, through such revealing, self-constituting performance, organizers take a political stance toward the community future, toward a place-based future shaped through a cooperative responsiveness from the initial questioning onwards. So we see once more that the process of political and community organizing, what some might call the agonistic process of making demands on the city or state, may well require and have a fine-grained texture of relationship building and rebuilding as subjective organizers engage no less subjective community members in complex, subtle, politically and morally nuanced intersubjective ways. Right? Subject formation is not enough. Deers has learned, he tells us, not just that nobody's apathetic, not just that everybody cares about something, not just that organizers too often fail to appreciate these particular realities, but that the intersubjective work of questioning before answering, probing before presuming, listening before instructing will all be crucial to organizing efforts and political mobilization more generally. Now, so his suggestion of humility, questioning before answering, may reflect the wisdom of trying to learn before acting, but he's making a stronger claim. He's learned not only that nobody's apathetic, that everyone cares, but also that the organizers too often don't know what people care about. And what's more, not only don't they know, they often don't know about their own naturally occurring critical and pragmatic discourse analysis either, tapping into, as he put it, addressing, connecting with, speaking or appealing or relating to community members' passionate concerns. So Deers challenges us, just to wind up here. So Deers challenges us and organizers and others concerned with political mobilization to do a three-pronged critical naturalistic analysis. First, we have to recognize what we don't know about subjective identities and loyalties, hopes and fears revealed by the practices, the talk and discourse of community members, the others with whom we wish to work or live. And assessing those identities, what we might suspect, will be closely linked and reveal in turn the material and institutional conditions of those community members' lives, of course. Second, we have to work to recognize how our own presumptions and performances, our own inherited, pre-constructed knowledge and talk, our discursive practice, selectively and narrowly frame, more or less respectfully at that, the world we care about. And third, we have to work to learn to act and interact with, to relate intersubjectively to and connect with community members in ways as differentiated and as nuanced as community members' own multiple and heterogeneous interests and abilities, concerns and fears, inclinations and disinclinations, as Deers illustrated by sharing and transforming the parable of the duck hunter. Critical discourse analysis belongs, I suggest, not only to academic researchers, but to many more practitioners concerned, perhaps also, with political mobilization and practical reconstruction and more. I began with the lessons that my students taught me about the power of voice and a strategy of conducting practice-focused interviews. Right? Practice-focused oral history interviews. I moved to the lessons we could learn from intermediaries who have to listen critically in their work, doing their own situated discourse analysis in the service of furthering democratic deliberations practically in the face of contentious agonistic politics. I moved then to the lessons we could learn from community organizer Deers, showing and doing a critical naturalistic discourse analysis as an organizer. We might learn, I think, in a naturalistic way from situated critical discourse analysis as it occurs in challenging historical sites, as ordinary people do extraordinary things to confront inequalities of power and life chances, to gain respect and recognition, to transform social and political relations in ways that will promote rather than prevent human flourishing. We can do critically nuanced discourse analyses in both practical and legible, instructively revealing and readable ways. Thanks very much for your attention and comments, please.